Welcome, everyone. This is the afternoon session from 3:15 to 4 o'clock. And hello, and thank you for coming and joining us at Track 3. It's Patients as Partners and Drivers. This session is sponsored by Shire. And my name is Carol Dutch, and I will be your host today at today's session, which is called The Role of a Chief Science Officer, the Secret Sauce for Forward Movement in Research and Scientific Collaborations. As a reminder, this track is being live streamed, and I would like to welcome our remote attendees and remind everyone to download the mobile app to use some of our highlighted features like the live Q&A. So today, foundations are taking a large role in moving research efforts forward, but it can be difficult. It can be a difficult process. But a best practice seen among many foundations is the addition of a chief scientific officer. And our experts will be discussing the benefits of bringing one onto your foundation. To discuss the topic further, we've got Molly White, who's the chief executive officer at the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation, and John Porter, a neuromuscular disease consultant. So let's welcome them.
Hi, everybody. How many people in the room have some sort of research grants program already? Okay. And who has research staff of some type? Okay. And research platform, research strategy, sort of forward-looking research. Okay. Excellent. So we're just trying to sort of gauge. This is the kind of topic where you could go down a hole and you could spend a lot of time down there, and we don't want to do that to you. So what John and I want to talk about is how we came to bring a chief science officer to the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation, what the drivers were for that, and what it has brought to the institution. A lot of people, when they think about, and I should just mention, John and I are going to tag team this, so I'm going to start. John's going to talk about it from his point of view as the chief science officer, second one that we had, and then I'll just talk a little bit about what led us to actually bring on a chief science officer. So we'll go back and forth a little bit. Just testing. Okay. So often when you talk to people who are new to the process of bringing in research staff, there's a perspective around the drug development pipeline where you start at area A and you go through the process and you get to B. And if you follow all the steps, you're going to eventually get to the FDA and a phase 3 trial, and stuff will pop out the other end. And I'm sure everybody in this room knows that that's not the case, and that many, many more attempts fail than actually come to fruition, even out of phase 2. But I think one of the things we have learned, particularly in the 7 years that we've really been pushing the drug development pipeline at the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation, is that the process is really not linear. And you get very, very different individual players coming from academia and from industry with very different skill sets, very different levels of sophistication and knowledge about the disease and what it's going to take to target the disease and develop potential products for the disease. And you just have to really understand that you're meeting these different players where they are, and you're trying to help them, if they're the right potential partner, get into the end zone. And that's something that really requires a certain kind of expertise, both scientific and otherwise. So it's not a linear process. There are some sort of standardized pieces, but there's a lot of unique pieces as well. And it's really important to understand your disease trajectory, where your disease discovery is right now, where your pipeline is right now, and where you can really have to be the driver, because there's no other organization that's going to do the work. And I think that's where the chief science officer can really start to play in terms of identification and strategy around those questions. So one of the things that we were sort of involved in back in the day, our first chief science officer was Sharon Hesterly. She came out of MDA and PPMD, and she was one of the people who worked on the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiatives, CITI, that really took a look at what's a best practice array of projects at different points in the pipeline that patient advocacy organizations should consider undertaking to be best in class in terms of driving drug development and therapy development for their diseases. And they put together this kind of this overview, which is published and is really worth looking at. I think what the epiphany really was for us is that you need to look at this pipeline with this kind of perspective and understand where you need to drop in and do this work because no one else in the arena is going to do it. And I think one of the things that City's been really good about bringing to life for the patient advocacy space is that there's a role to play here that is above and beyond providing resources and education to patients living with diseases. There's actually a huge and expanding role in terms of drug development and actually helping drug developers be successful in drug development. And they really show you through some of these steps in the pipeline where you can drop in and where you are the only person that's going to drop in and do that. I think the other piece around this is that the organization, I mean, you look at the work that's being done here, whether it's a PFDD meeting or regulatory advocacy or biomarker and endpoint identification and development or building out a clinical research network. It takes a certain amount of capacity and sophistication in the organization as well. So you have a significant need for a chief science officer who's able to drive this, identify and drive this kind of work, and then you need an organization that has the capacity and sophistication to support it. So I think it's definitely chief science officer driven, and the organization needs to be there too. So when we started, what drove us to bring on our first chief science officer was literally something we called MDF 3.0. We brought in a little over $5 million to accelerate drug development in our foundation. And we looked at the entire pipeline from basic science through to the payer environment, including the regulatory environment, and we identified projects all along that pipeline that were either significant opportunities, time-sensitive opportunities, significant barriers, or just issues that needed to be addressed to get drug developers to invest in this disease. And we put together an array of projects that were everything from a clinical research network to a back transgenic mouse to iPSC cell line libraries to endpoint and biomarker development, you name it. It was pretty much in there. There was no way an organization could do this kind of work without a chief science officer. And John's going to get into this, but it's not just any chief science officer either. You're really talking about someone who has expertise around the drug development pipeline, translational science, bench science, and an array of other things very specific to your disease. It's a complicated job to do. It requires a lot of different skill sets. And as you can see from the kind of work that we actually executed over the last 3 years, it was mission critical to actually getting this work done. And I should say that the other piece of this MDF 3.0 project was Sharon and I we actually did the work to create the platform and design the projects, which could not have been done without a chief science officer either. So in addition to having someone who can launch the RFAs and drive this work, you need somebody who can actually drive the strategy behind it. So that's what led us to bringing in a chief science officer. And John, as our third chief science officer, can tell you a little bit more about what it looks like to be in the chair.
Sure. Thanks, Molly.
Yes.
Okay, where do I point? Out that way? Yeah. Okay. So the first question is, why a chief science officer? I think you can bring in people with all sorts of a variety of backgrounds. I mean, I guess there's no such thing as a traditional career anymore. My background was 21 years in academic research where I worked on muscle biology and disease. And then I went to the NINDS, where I managed funding for neuromuscular diseases for 10 years before deciding that I wanted to go to work for one of the advocacy groups that I'd been working with NIH. So that's non-traditional career, right? But I think there's nothing, no longer anything such as a traditional career. So you can work with a variety of backgrounds. I mean, people out of industry who know the drug development process, but just somebody with science background. Very unlikely to find somebody in your specific disease unless you're getting a postdoc right out of one of the labs that's working on your disease. But then there's drawbacks there that person hasn't had that much experience with the grant system, hasn't had that much experience working with drug companies unless their project is a postdoc, is a therapy development project. So, but you can work with a variety of backgrounds for this kind of job. And what I'm going to talk about is really 4 different areas that a chief science officer can bring to the process. Having the knowledge to help support the activities, having the relationships with people in industry, people in academia and at the NIH and other governmental agencies. In communication, having that kind of as a correlate of the knowledge, but being able to work with all the stakeholders in your field from a high knowledge level. And then finally, innovation and problem solving, which is really what you do as part of getting an advanced degree right there. So I think an important thing to recognize is that being in a nonprofit is a unique sort of environment for a scientist, and you really have to think about that when you're looking at who to recruit, who's going into that. In a small organization, they may be the only scientist when they're used to working with teams as part of research. And so there's just things you need to be careful about as far as making sure that there's a fit, and we can come back to this in questions, okay? So this is our city slide. So Molly mentioned the city effort on how patient advocacy groups, nonprofits can interact with the drug development process. They actually have an extended white paper on that, and it's real. If you haven't seen that, I'd Google it and pull it up. Really a great thing to feed off of. When I first saw it, the idea of tying your activities to the drug development pipeline helped put them in perspective, okay? Then you could explain to your board members, you can explain to patients why having an animal model not having an animal model can be just as big a barrier as not having something much later in the process, okay? It may stop you very early in drug development. So it's great to put things in the context of matching your activities to pipeline. And so I just highlighted and read a couple of things. So having animal and cell model development early in discovery phases, working with clinical trial design, recruitment, retention, gives you more credibility with the companies you work with if they can come to you and get that type of help. And then finally, like patient-focused drug development activity at the regulatory stage. So it really becomes a checkbox, that city list. Their project was what could a patient advocacy group do related to the pipeline. We looked at it, what does a patient advocacy group need to do? Because you have to start checking all these different things off. So it's really good to put things in that kind of context. So as I said, I'm going to go through 4 different areas that we think a chief science officer can bring value to your organization. So the first of these is augmenting the knowledge of the organization. So as Molly mentioned, one of the things that you have to do very early on is take a realistic assessment of the potential pitfalls and the potential opportunities in your particular disease to try to move things along a therapy development pipeline, and then produce realistic plans according to that analysis. Plans that fit within the direct needs of the disease field, and plans that fit within the organizational capacity of the organization that you're working with, staffing, dollars, those sorts of things. Shortly after I went to NIH, we had a workshop where I had Ade Kay, who's formerly of Genzyme, and then he was CEO of Sarepta, and he's now with a company called Stoke Therapeutics at this point. And I was talking to Ed about the development of myosin at Genzyme. So this is an enzyme replacement therapy, one of the first that was developed, and it's been a very successful program, okay? At the time, Genzyme didn't know what a barrier it was to not understand the natural history of the disease, to not have an endpoint that you could use for clinical trials, to not even have a registry of where the patients are to help you enroll in clinical trials. They didn't recognize, this was early 2000s, they didn't recognize what a barrier that was. So they took the drug through early development and they were ready to go to the clinic, and it was a tough moment for them because then they realized that, what do we do now? We don't have any of these tools in place. So he said to me something like this quote here. I don't remember the exact quote, but if we'd realized what a barrier it was to not understand natural history, to not have an endpoint that we could use for assessing efficacy in the clinical trial, we may never have launched the Myozyme program to begin with, okay? So I think that highlights, you wouldn't think that a company like Genzyme would have that kind of issue, but they were in early days back then, okay? So I think from that viewpoint, it really highlights that you've got to address the clinical trial readiness issues. And having science background within your organization. Sure, you can have a scientific advisory committee or scientific advisory board that can give you outside input. But if you're really going to go at this process strongly and not have some of the conflicts that could be introduced with outside advisors, some self-interest and things like that, the idea of having somebody internal, a scientific person internal, to help with that. And so in terms of their knowledge base, they can help and lead consortium activities. So a number of organizations have developed drug development roundtables to bring academics and companies together to talk about pre-competitive space type things. This clinical trial readiness have used that kind of approach. There's the NCATS, Rare Disease Clinical Research Network applications that can really help jumpstart this trial readiness piece, addressing registries, endpoints, biomarkers. You can do all those kinds of activities within those applications. It's good to have, first of all, they have to have advocacy group involvement to do one of those applications, to do an RDC or an application. But you can actually help lead those things and help push the field toward those things. And same thing with critical path institutes, initiatives, the biomarker and endpoint qualification process. I think those kind of things they can push. And so the final thing as far as knowledge base is having a good idea what motivates pharma. If you're trying to get biotech and pharmaceutical firms to work on your disease, and that's really the bottom line here, right? Understanding what they need, okay? So somebody that has a good idea of the process and can help drive that, can talk with pharma and help drive that. So putting drug discovery and development into context, I think the first bullet is something, I put neurological disorders, but no matter what your disease, I think this is something that we've all experienced. You look at the literature, if you're a mouse and you have a disease, you've got a treatment for everything. Okay, everything works in the mouse. You've got a drug. But the reality is the mouse doesn't really have your disease, okay? The mouse made genetic model with maybe some symptoms and everything, but there's other problems with the mouse studies that I think we heard about some in the session across the hall this morning for any of you that were there, that they don't necessarily reflect issues like delivery, exposure at target tissue, and level of effect, or certainly level of effect, not enough attention is paid to that particular parameter. But you know, if you see a 5% increase or decrease in a protein you're trying to knock up or down, depending on what your disease mechanism is that going to be sufficient to translate? Hey, it may be statistically significant in inbred mice at a P of 0.001 level. It might be significant, but is a 5% level of effect going to be sufficient to translate into the human studies? So I think paying attention to these kinds of things, to how rigorously the animal studies were done, is something you want to have a science person in your organization help tell you that. Because, hey, the paper might be published in Nature or Science. That doesn't mean that means it's probably statistically valid, but that doesn't mean that the animal study is necessarily going to produce a good candidate therapeutic that should go to the clinic, okay? So, and then that really comes to the question, how many successful mouse therapies that you know about have then translated into the clinic and become a successful drug is really my point. So you have to ask the questions of what the mouse can deliver. What can we legitimately ask the mouse? Can we just say target engagement and modulation? Or do we need something more than that? Or can we get something more than that out of the mouse? Science people in your organization, an organizational understanding of how these studies need to be structured and what sorts of information you need to get out of them and how you should interpret the findings and whether it's adequate scientific rationale to drive a clinical trial is something that the science people in your organization can help give you in moving forward. Okay, next item is really augmenting relationships with the CSO. So you really have to evaluate potential relationships. Do you want to collaborate with everybody that comes to you? Do you know whether it's worthwhile to pursue a particular avenue that a particular biotech comes to you and says, hey, we want to work with you on this? You want to have the capability of evaluating those opportunities. And so having someone to help you do that, to trust with the people you decide to work with, and to speak their language and really challenge them on their home turf. So when a company says something to you, when the CEO and the CSO are meeting with them, and you think that's out of line, the way they're thinking about your disease, you have the ability to call them on that and to challenge them on that and say, but you're not thinking about this. Because remember, we're trying to convince companies that we've de-risked this disease and you need to work on our disease, okay? So what that really comes down to is working with the academics, working with the federal agencies, the NIH, FDA, other agencies, and working with companies in really a bi-directional fashion. Not just them coming to you and saying, we need this or we need that, but that it's a bi-directional exchange. There's value passing both ways with any of the parties that you work with. Just as an example, with academics, because I wrote grants myself for 21 years, and then I was at NIH handing out grant money in neuromuscular disease. I'll tell our investigators to give me a specific aims page of their NIH grant application, and I'll review that. Or if I know what they're doing and I know what somebody else is doing from confidential information, I'll say, you two guys need to talk to each other, okay? So if your organization can do that, you can really raise the level of your impact on the field. And you do that with a bi-directional communication. You have relationships that are strong, that trust. You know you're dealing with somebody with high integrity on the other end because you've had the relationship for a while. You can do a lot with that. Okay, third item is communication. And I started out with the hype issue because I think that's one thing that we really have to be aware of in rare diseases. That hype is not data. Hype is not realistic hope of getting to a therapy. Now, who in here has it not popped up that CRISPR is going to cure your disease within 6 months or a year? Okay? I mean, it's just there. Or the renaissance in gene therapy. Certainly, it's looking more promising. Hey, the SMA gene therapy with Avexis looks great. You know, looks like that may work. Okay? But then the oligo worked really well in SMA too. Okay? But you want to be able to understand the technology and evaluate the technology. Is it going to work for your disease? Is a venture philanthropy approach, if you've got the money to launch into that, to helping foster really early stage clinical development efforts, if you've got the money to do that, is that the right thing for your disease? And I can't answer that question unless we look at your disease very carefully, right? So having people to help you do that, I mean, this next bullet is I just wanted to include this. One of the things that I've done with MDF is that every time we have a meeting with a company, we'll produce a summary document for our board that says, okay, here's the level of interaction with these folks, here's what they're doing, and often that's confidential information, and we let our board know that it's confidential information that's been shared under CDA with our organization. But that really helps you build credibility with your board too, and make them understand where you're trying to go. When you can say, hey, we've talked with companies X, Y, and Z. Here's where they're at, here's where their therapy development strategy is, here's the kind of resources that they're putting into the program. If you can have those kind of conversations, it's really helpful within the organization. And as I said, that's really only going to come about with trust and confidence in the partners that you're working with. So the last bullet, again, this is really the ultimate, one of your ultimate goals, is you're trying to show companies your disease is tractable. that they have the choice with their technology, their approach of working on 50 diseases. You want them to pick yours. And so you want to have the disease de-risked. You want to show it's tractable. I think if you have a chief science officer in your organization and they can help have those conversations with companies, help convince the companies that you guys know what the heck you're talking about, and that indeed these particular things are in place. Because even if you get to a middle-level person that's running a lab at a company that is very interested in your disease, they've got to sell their program up the ladder to get money to work on your disease. And you want to give them the ammunition where they can strongly sell your disease, okay? Again, these are the types of things I think if you have a good science person in your organization, you can do. And then so finally, the innovation problem-solving piece. Oh, I skipped over. Sorry, I skipped over a couple things. Okay, so therapeutic misconception. That's one of the things that come out of hype. Everybody know what therapeutic misconception is? Being in a clinical trial, you think you're being treated for the disease. Okay, you think you're being treated. You are being given a therapy. That's therapeutic misconception, when a clinical trial is really an experiment. So rampant and very damaging. Patients start asking, why isn't this drug being approved? This drug, not this experimental agent, okay? Well, it didn't show anything in the clinical trials. But patients might push for a drug that they got in a clinical trial and say, this should be approved. You need to understand within your organization and be able to deal with that. And I think the science perspective helps you deal with that particular issue. Okay, sorry I'd skipped over that one. Okay, so finally, the innovation and problem solving. So as I said earlier, that we've got rapidly changing technology right now. We've got very quickly changing perspectives for pharma and biotech. Rare diseases are now the thing for a lot of pharma and biotech, okay? But you got to understand their perspective and their thinking about that. Regulatory issues are changing really rapidly too. So again, following that, being able to evaluate that, I think is a major reason you want a science officer in there. And as we said, the next hot therapy, CRISPR or whatever, may or may not have value for your disease. It doesn't mean, but it's showing up in social media. It's showing up in the regular media. And your board may be asking about it. Your patients may be asking about it. Again, they may think that this is going to be a quick therapy. Well, they said the same thing about gene therapy a lot of years ago. They've said the same thing about cell therapies a lot of years ago. So being able to realistically evaluate and triage opportunities is really a function of a chief science officer. So your organizations need to think innovatively in how you're going to invest scarce resources, your time, your money, because most of us are not very big, is really important. So despite all the promise that new candidate strategies for developing therapies have been showing in recent years, and it looks really good. I mean, I think certainly things have advanced in gene therapy quite a bit. A lot of the problems are being solved. CRISPR looks interesting, but there's immune reactions to Cas9 in a high percentage of the population. There's the off-target editing issues that have to be addressed. Maybe good for ex vivo editing right now, but injecting the reagents in vivo, I think, probably has a lot of problems to still be worked out. But you want to be able to evaluate that. So over the next 20 years, I think patient advocacy groups are going to have to better understand the process of drug discovery and development, better understand the regulatory issues, be able to better interact with their communities as things show up on people's Facebook feeds and what do we do with this particular issue. And so I think that's where it's really helpful to have a chief science officer.
Okay, so That was a lot of information. I think, so you heard from John sort of the different tiers that he kind of breaks the chief science officer role out into. Information and knowledge, influence around certain stakeholder groups, just serious bench, science information. If you're the CEO, you think about this in terms of, I have to get a number of things done for this organization, for this community of patients, and how is this person an influencer? How is this person going to help make that happen? And when I think about, what does a CSO or a senior science staff person do for an organization, clearly they deliver the scientific expertise. And I think John's point around, we have to get more and more sophisticated. You guys are all seeing this. If you look at what patient advocacy organizations were doing 10 years ago, and what they were being expected and asked to do, it is radically, radically different than what best-in-class patient advocacy organizations are doing now. Now we are really expected to be pretty strategic partners, and there are roles that we're expected to play. If we don't play them, they don't get done in the drug development pipeline and in the science discovery arena, and it's actually a whole. And we know from when I got to the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation in 2012, we were talking to one pharmaceutical company, and now we're talking to about 30. And really, that boiled down to, do we have the scientific expertise to deliver what they need to see at whatever level of product development they are currently operating in? Do we bring capacity to implement and drive a scientific and drug development agenda? And can we do that in a way that reflects what industry and the academic environment and the regulatory environment need for where that disease is right now? And do we have the credibility and influence to really build the kinds of partnerships with the regulatory environment, with industry, with academia, to become an important voice? When you talk with a smaller biotech in industry, they may have 5 people on staff. They may have just gotten their first Series A. They may be targeting 5 different diseases. They don't know that much about myotonic dystrophy. They're really interested to know who the KOLs are. They need more information on biomarkers. They need a lot of help from an organization like a patient advocacy organization, and they have nowhere else to go. They don't know all of the knowledge leaders in the space. They don't know what all the resources are that are out there, many of which your organization will have funded and started. So you have a really important role to play in all of that credibility and influencing around partnerships. And you become the agent that makes the connections between the guy in the scientific academic environment that's doing CNS work on pediatrics and the company that really wants to do CNS targeting therapies for this disease, where a pediatric patients can be their best first bet. And you become the people that can tell them where they can find particular myoblasts and where they can find particular tissue if they need tissue, and which mice are working well and which mice are not working well. So they're not going to know any of this stuff. And some of the bigger organizations really aren't either, because they're working on so many different diseases. So you really have to be this knowledge base, and you really have to own all the pieces of the space that no one else is going to drive. And there's more and more of them all the time now. So being credible and being a known entity in your disease arena is really important and becomes a huge asset in terms of driving drug development forward. And it also really raises disease visibility. I mean, as you guys know, you're trying to be the prettiest girl at dance. And there's many rare diseases out there, and when you talk to these industry partners, they're considering different diseases. And they're looking for diseases that their assets can target, that have the right capacity, that have the right infrastructure in place, that have lowered the risk around biomarkers, endpoints, clinical trial design, and all of the things. And that's where bringing visibility to the disease and making sure that industry knows about your disease is another chief science officer role that's very important. So I think, for us, the pipeline that we have right now, albeit very much preclinical and early stage, speaks for itself. We could not have pulled off what we've pulled off without having really, really stupendous chief science officer level staff. And we will continue to invest in that pretty heavily going forward. So, I would make a strong argument to anybody around that piece. So we were trying very hard to keep this to about 30, 40 minutes in case you all had questions. There were some other sort of pragmatic issues around the nuance of bringing in a senior science person that we can speak to if anyone is interested. But I think at this point, we just want to thank everybody for listening, and we'll take any questions people have.
Thank you very much, Molly and John. Yes, we got a couple questions. Excellent. If you could state your name and so the live stream audience can hear, and the question, please.
Hi, Molly and John. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really insightful. Terry Klein, National NPS Society. What do you say? The business model is so perfect. It really is. It's obviously where everybody wants to go. We are trying to find the cure. But what do you say to the organizations that are struggling in that revenue stream of maybe $2 to $5 million of revenue? And how do they get that CSO on staff? And if they were to choose to take that route, what do they let go of? Who gets sacrificed?
Do you want that one, John?
CEO?
You know, it's tough. I mean, we actually had to go to an angel donor, and we had to bring in a significant gift to launch that position. And we actually built MDF 3.0 as a huge proposal to a particular donor with the argument that a key component, in fact, part of the funding for MDF 3.0 was going to be this chief science officer. It is tough. It's chicken and egg. I absolutely understand what you're saying, because you also need regulatory support and advocacy support. You also need care program related project development support. You need operations and management. It's an ongoing struggle. I think what we have found is that there's more resource in the space, the more of this you do. So, if you look at what our budget was when I got to the organization in 2012 and you look at the budget now, it's a lot bigger. And I think it's a lot bigger because visibility has grown. We have more and more people in the community. We have far more donors. We're bringing in more money. And it does start to build on itself. Without knowing your specific situation, it'd be hard to kind of parse where you would cut and build. But I think if you can figure out a way to fund that first position, you can really start to build a lot of capacity off of it. And I will say, when we hired Sharon, who was just the bomb, she came in as research director. And she quickly found that for her to do her job in the milieu that she was doing it, she needed the title of chief science officer. So we sort of matriculated to that role. And I think part of the question that you really want to look at is, do you need a PhD out of a disease-specific lab that has 3 years of experience that can start doing portfolio management and can do industry calls with you to start to build it? Because that person's going to be a lot cheaper than a John or a Sharon. John is just obscenely expensive. I'm kidding. But, you can start to build from a place of someone with disease expertise who's got the right level of information to go to an industry meeting and answer molecular questions, but doesn't have to be as senior as somebody like John, who's been an NINDS and run his own lab. So there's also a way to sort of scale it based on the work that you have available.
But it kind of depends, though.
We have a couple more questions, too.
Yeah, but so between academics and NIH, I had 31 years in the career, and I was retiring from the government at 62 when I went to an advocacy position. So I had medical insurance covered in retirement from the government. I had 403B and government plans and everything. So I could have been a lot more expensive. but if you can get somebody like that, and gee, I don't know what you think about the idea of having a paid consultant for a group that's small, but that still brings the person in, because I think a scientific advisory, it's one of the things we put up here. I think a scientific advisory committee can be incredibly valuable, and ours has been incredibly valuable. But I think it's different to have an internal person. I think it steps it up to a higher level. I mean, you've got to arrange for a scientist at University of Iowa to go with you to meetings in Cambridge with companies, whereas like Molly and I go to a meeting in Boston, and we have 10 visits lined up with companies within a few block area, right, in Cambridge. So.
But I think what you're saying is, how do you even get started? Where do you find the resource, and how do you build it? And I think, to John's point, you start with maybe a scientific advisory board. You can bring in a part-time consultant if you can find one, and you can sort of scale from there.
Here's a couple.
I think you answered one of my questions. Jane Gunther with Cure Catasil. I'm kind of wondering if you can give an idea of like when to bring in a CSO, and define that a little bit tighter as to like what would you need to have on the table that would make you go, we need to have a CSO helping us with this? And also, what kind of things would the CSO be looking for, like, in terms of support that you would already have in place that would encourage them to be coming into your organization? I think you covered some of that, but maybe, do you have to have a registry and a biomarker and patient history in order to have a CSO that's interested?
Well, I mean, we've had 3 CSOs. They've all been radically, radically different people, and they've brought in different types of expertise and different levels of appetite for different kinds of work. And I think it's like hiring anybody else. There's some people you hire that are willing to get in the trench, do the entire vertical and everything that's required in it, and there are people that either don't want to do it or don't understand it, and don't have any appetite for it. I think we touched on this a little bit in the earlier answer. If you manage to bring in somebody who's really loaded for bear and they have translational science experience and maybe they've worked in pharma and they've had a lab and they've got a really strong PhD and they're really respected in your disease, you have to be able to deliver the work that's going to keep them there. And not only do you need the salary because you're already competing in that arena, and the benefits package, but you have to be able to deliver work that's going to keep them engaged and interested. And if you can't look 3 years out in your research strategic plan and know that you have the project development, the project execution, and the funding to deliver that, then you do want to go back to that idea of somebody who's 2 years out of a PhD program, who's been in the lab and maybe doesn't want to do lab work for the rest of their life and doesn't want to have to live grant to grant and is interested in something a little more diverse that maybe is going to allow them to train up a little at the same time. It really does depend on the work that you can deliver, though. Yeah.
Nothing to add.
Does that answer?
I think, and I had a question. I'm Mary Cobb, and I'm on the board of the Phelan-McDermott Syndrome Foundation, and we've had this discussion over and over and over again about whether to bring on a consultant or somebody to go through this array of activities that we have, from models to PCORI grants to RDC, et cetera. And it's always like, what kind of person? And that's a really interesting point you made about what can you offer, which is so hard to hypothesize, like what is going to be there, where the need is looking at the assets we have, and what's most important and will help us to move forward. So it's like, what kind of person, and experience.
Well, we brought actually Jane Larkindale in, who's now splitting her time with CPATH and I think FARA, to do a 50-page landscape assessment of the disease arena. And we started from, here's where we are, here's where we want to get, and started that analysis. And you can start to understand what you need based on your assessment of the landscape. And we do a landscape assessment every single year. And we come up with the next series of recommendations for both the CARE and CURE platform based on those assessments. But I think that helps you decide, who you need.
Yeah, well, I think any companies that you start talking to, you just ask the companies about what they need to try to move to convince their leadership to let them start to invest in a particular disease. Yeah.
I think we're just ready to wrap this up. So let's thank, please, Molly and John for this really insightful presentation. I'd like to remind everyone to complete their survey.